Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the ISF Bright Talk channel. My name is Dan Norman, Senior Solutions Analyst at the ISF, and today we'll be wrapping up the ISF Cyber Security Showcase week. And joining me today is Gareth Haken, Senior Research Analyst at the ISF, who will be discussing how you can best leverage the offerings from the ISF to effectively manage risk. And with this in mind, it's great to see so many ISF members in attendance this afternoon. But before we start, there are a few housekeeping items to cover off. The presentation will last approximately 30 to 40 minutes and then end with a question and answer session. Please make sure, if you have any questions, type them into the questions pane in the box on your screen at any time. All viewers are automatically muted, and if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please just leave the webinar and dial back in. Finally, this session, as well as all of the sessions throughout this week, have been recorded and are available on demand via our Cyber Awareness Hub, which you can access using the link below. Now, I'll hand over to Gareth and I'll return for our Q&A in about 30 to 40 minutes time. So take it away, Gareth.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that kind introduction. So, managing risk the ISF way. So, as Dan said, my name is Gareth Haken. He has demoted me there. I'm now principal analyst, but that's fairly recent, so all forgiven. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, everything that we do at the ISF, really, in one way or another, is to do with reducing risk or managing risk. Now, we have some products and some reports that very specifically address the issue of risk, certainly in terms of assessment and things like that. But like I said, most of the things that we do at the ISF have an information risk management slant. So just a quick introduction. I've been a member of the ISF Global team for since June 2017, so over 5 years now. Previous experience mostly with police and military units in an intelligence gathering role, some cybercrime investigation, some threat intelligence work, and software development. I tend to come at things from a slightly technical angle, although have a good level of experience more in the sort of business side of things as well. Just a point of note, so I've also been heavily involved in a lot of the risk assessment work that the ISF do. So I was the Standard Good Practice lead author for 2020 and 2022, and I've also had heavy involvement with the two risk assessment methodologies that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so a quick agenda. First off, I'm going to look at what we actually mean by managing risk. Just go through a few of the components, put them into some kind of framework. We don't have an official risk management framework, but I feel that with our various different deliverables, we cover off all of those components to a very good level of detail. So the three products that we're going to look at today are the Standard Good Practice, our Quantitative Information Risk Assessment Methodology, and our Information Risk Assessment Methodology, or IRAM2. There'll also be an opportunity at the end for any questions. Okay, so managing risk. What do we mean by managing risk? Risk is something that has been around for eons, for thousands of years. It's something that humans have always kind of looked to mitigate and make very quick decisions about. And even if that wasn't necessarily inside some kind of framework, but it's active across multiple disciplines, and that includes obviously information security as well, with a risk-based approach being one of the more popular ways to address your information security issues. So this is a slide that we have in one of our IRAM2 workshops, and I think it demonstrates really nicely the different components of risk management. So you can see on the screen there everything from monitoring, aggregating, analysing, assessing, treating, reviewing, reporting. And the reason that we structure this diagram in this way to start with is to really look at the idea that most of these things, or in fact all of these things, can't really exist without that kind of assessment piece in the middle. So we can't really aggregate our risks unless we know what they are. We obviously can't treat our risks unless we know what they are. Analyze is a little bit different, I feel. It's almost a subset of assessment. I'm going to cover that point off very specifically when we start looking at the quantitative information risk assessment methodology, and do a very sort of quick comparison to FAIR, which is probably at the minute one of the market leading quantitative information risk assessment models. Reporting, obviously, if we don't know what the risks are, we can't report on them. Same with monitoring, and the same with reviewing. So this really kind of pushes the idea that that assessment piece is really the most prominent part in terms of managing risk, because everything else hangs off of that particular piece. And this is one area that the ISF have some really, really good material on. So we have two separate risk assessment methodologies that we've already mentioned, and we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail. We have other various different reports that look at risk assessment. So protecting the crown jewels, which is a report that looks at risk assessing those very, very precious, very, very valuable assets to an organization. So yeah, this is something the ISF has lots and lots of material on. And I think it's fair to say that in some aspects we are a little bit ahead of the game. So the relevant ISF materials, and what I hope to show you is that those components that we looked at on this slide are covered off in some instances to a very, very good level of detail by those three pieces of ISF material. Now, that's not to say that these are the only pieces of ISF material that help with those particular components, but certainly these are the ones I think that play a very, very big role when we look at those different components. So the first one, standard good practice. So I like to look at this as a compendium, so a compendium of good practice. It's about 400 pages long, so it's very, very expansive in terms of its content. I'll go into how it's broken down and everything in a second, but it can be looked at in different ways. So it's kind of different things to different organizations. Some organizations use it as a starting point for their policy standards and procedures. So for a lot of information security policies, you will find a good 80% of the content within the standard of good practice. Some people look at this as a reference guide. So maybe you want to look at security awareness, where we have a whole category on security awareness, and some people look at it as a controls framework. I'm going to look at it in terms of those components that we looked at a second ago, those information risk management components, and show you how that document can help in one or more of those. So the QIRA methodology, this was developed last year. So yeah, it's been a long couple of years with COVID, but yeah, it definitely was last year that we released this. Very, very solid approach to quantitative information risk assessment. I feel like there is this is something that grows year on year in terms of uptake. It is still quite, I suppose, embryonic in a way in terms of the amount of people looking at quantitative approaches. But it's certainly where I think risk assessment will continue to go in the next few years. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a second. And then our other piece of ISF material there, IRAM2, this has been around in different guises for probably nearly 20 years. So this was released in 2014, but prior to that we had IRAM, which is now sort of IRAM 1. I mean, that was around from sort of 2006 onwards. Prior to that, it was a different methodology. So the ISF has had some kind of qualitative risk assessment methodology, probably nearly since it was created, I would say. And IRAM 2 is the latest version of that. So there's a lot of pedigree in terms of that qualitative approach. Okay, so like I said, with each of these components, I want to kind of show where the various sort of ISF materials fit in. So as a kind of high level view, we can see that for aggregate, we have the QIRA methodology. Because QIRA uses financial figures to show loss and to define risk, so financial ranges, it's very easy to aggregate multiple assessments into one overarching aggregated risk figure. And actually, we'll see when we look at QIRA, but one of the phases results in an aggregated risk. So you may look at 10 threat events, let's say, and it will show you those individually in terms of the level of risk associated with them, but it will then aggregate those into one score. You can then aggregate multiple assessments fairly easily, given the nature of the way risk is reported. IRAM 2, it is possible, but because it's qualitative, because it uses sort of ordinal scales and ratings and things like that, it is a little bit sort of harder to do, but not, not that difficult, I would say. We just don't provide a mechanism for doing it. However, I know a lot of members that are able to aggregate multiple IRAM 2 risk assessments. Treat is a really big one. So all three really align to the treat component. So standard good practice, like I said, is a very large controls framework. So it's fairly obvious that when you're looking at treatment options, there's a wealth of material in the standard good practice. And IRAM 2 and QIRA have specific phases on treatment. Some risk assessment methodologies sort of stop before that treatment element. They give you the risks, but they don't necessarily go into how you might treat them, whereas both of our risk assessment methodologies do, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a second. Analyze is a bit of a, well, not a strange one, but it's to me, it's a subset of assessment. So assessment is the whole thing. So it's finding your risks, or it's identifying your risks and then analyzing them, and then looking at treatment options. To me, that's the whole sort of assessment piece in one go. Whereas obviously both of our risk assessment methodologies do that, so they both are valid when it comes to the analyze component. Reporting, this is one we get asked about a lot. So reporting is really key. Obviously, you've done a lot of good work. You may be reporting to a board or senior management, and you really want to get your message across. You're normally going to be asking for things that the people you're asking may be reluctant to release, i.e. money for new controls to mitigate risks. But using standard good practice, there's a whole topic on risk reporting. Using QIRA as well, which looks at a more return on security investment approach, you're able to get that message very, very succinct and get your point across very, very easily or very quickly, showing those kind of potential losses versus what a number of controls might cost. So both those materials help to a good level with reporting. And again, that's not to say IRAM 2 doesn't. IRAM 2, part of each of the phases, there is a kind of an output. So when you're using the tool, that's in the form of a PDF, using the web application, sorry, and those individual PDFs make up that report. I would say there's probably a little bit more work that needs to be doing before you deliver that to a board. It's more of a report to a line manager, I would say. And monitor and review. So again, the standard good practice has a topic on monitoring, and actually there's a few places in the standard good practice when we start looking at review or reviewing our risks. Okay, so what I want to do before we move on is just really again reiterate that actually the main part of that particular diagram, the assess piece, is covered very, very well by ISF materials. It's covered by two separate methodologies, two separate processes, and gives you a really rigorous structure or framework in which to assess your risks. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to look in a little bit more detail at each of those three pieces of ISF material that we've covered off thus far. So the first one is the standard good practice. You can see the four components that I think it covers off very well within the title slide there, and we're going to look at how standard good practice can help manage risk. So the first one, and this is a diagram from the first few pages of the standard good practice, and there's a little bit of internal kind of disagreement on the order of this diagram. Personally, I would say potentially a risk assessment first, then treat with a standard good practice, series of controls, then evaluate using the benchmark, then enhance with ISF research, and in that interim period until you come around to your next risk assessment, which may be a year, 2 years, or whatever your own kind of internal frequencies are. But I just think it shows as well the versatility of the standard good practice, and it can be sort of used in various different ways. But that to me is sort of using the standard good practice as a controls framework. So, you know, traditional kind of ISO 27002 NIST cybersecurity framework kind of controls framework. So that's one way of using not just the standard good practice, but using multiple ISF materials to manage risk. In the standard good practice content, and it's broken down across what we call categories, so 17 categories. One of those categories is information risk. And there we go, there's a little bit of animation just to highlight those topics and areas that look at information risk in the standard good practice. This is a screenshot taken from our online web application, which houses the standard good practice content. So for any ISF members on the call, this is available to you for you to use, you know, now if you have an ISF Live login, and you'll find that you can tailor the content a little bit. You can annotate it. You can start internal discussions, external discussions. Just gives you a few more kind of capabilities beyond the sort of PDF and the hard copy version. But we have nine topics there in total, which deal with different kind of aspects of information risk. So the management approach, how you select the methodology, supporting materials that you need to define, then how you scope a risk assessment. So there'll be things like triggers in there, what should trigger a risk assessment, what certain circumstances, how you conduct a business impact assessment, how you do a threat profiling exercise, a vulnerability assessment or a gap analysis, risk evaluation, so how you actually evaluate those risks, and then finally risk treatment at the end there. So what do you think about in terms of treating those particular risks? These aren't the only topics on information risk. So we do have a topic on risk appetite, which is in the governance section, which I think you can just see on that screenshot there, SG13. So this is more about how the risk appetite is set, what needs to be considered, what level the risk appetite should be set at, and things like that. So it's not just when you look at the standard good practice content through a risk lens, it's not just the information risk category that you need to consider. There are other topics sort of dotted around the content that are also of use from a risk perspective. Treatment. Now, this is I won't spend too long on this because I could spend a day on this, or probably a week. So when we look at treatment in terms of, or risk treatment in terms of the standard good practice, there's various different levels to look at it. So we have a whole topic on risk treatment. This is more the process, so the available options, how you kind of structure it, you know, how you report those treatment options and things like that. But actually, the whole document can be considered a controls framework, and thus, when you come to look at treatment, you really have a 400-page book of information security good practice to utilize in various different ways. So if you know that you have an issue with, say, firewalls, you can go to the firewall topic. If you have an issue with system access, there's a whole category on system access. So the whole content, really, from a treatment perspective, can be used when determining those treatment options. And like I said, the content itself is structured in a very nice and easy to use layout. So using this categories, areas, topics concept, there are 142 topics. Each topic is probably on average 20 to 35 control statements long. So, I mean, you know, you start doing the maths on that and you see the breadth of material that is available when you start considering risk treatment. So report, monitor, and review. So report is covered in its own individual topic. So information risk reporting, AS14. So this is things like it will tell you things such as you need a documented procedure to cover off different aspects of reporting. So things like the audience. So what are the audience's requirements? You must present treatment options, you know, things like that. It will kind of set up at a high level the sort of things to consider when you are reporting risk. It then goes into a bit more detail of each of those. So in terms of the requirements of the audience, things like style expected, risk ratings used. So this idea that if one part of an organization uses a certain set of risk ratings to report risk, then that should be across the board, so everybody understands that a moderate risk, or even if it's financial figure or whatever it might be, everybody understands that what that is, because they've encountered it in their own sort of domains. Frequency, so it will talk about what sort of frequency do you want to or you need to look at in terms of reporting risk. What the report should cover, so things like changes to the threat landscape, any kind of sensitive or critical information that's been uncovered as part of the risk assessment, actions required to minimize risk, the treatment options, things like that. So it's probably about 25 to 30 statements of good practice in terms of information risk reporting, and it's backed up as well by ISF materials. So again, just because we're looking at 3 pieces of ISF material, there are many others that I could talk about for a good couple of hours. Some of them are a little bit older, but a lot of the concepts don't change. So we have an entire report on information risk reporting as well. And that actually leads into a nice point about the standard of practice, in that the content itself is built from those research reports. So it's kind of a condensed version of probably a lot of what the ISF has done in the last 30 years. Obviously, some parts lose relevance and are removed, but it's a very good starting point in terms of what the ISF offers and what the ISF covers. So that information risk report, the reporting information risk report, it's a bit of a mouthful. That was written about 5 years ago, and that, when the standard of practice was updated, that would have been brought in as a topic. So that's where that topic comes from. So monitoring, we have 2 topics: security monitoring and reporting. Again, I won't run through everything in that, but that will again guide you through the kind of things to consider when you look at monitoring security and risk, when to report it, frequencies, aligning it with business objectives and strategic objectives and things like that. And then we have a topic on security assurance program as well. And then review. So this one is a little bit more harder to point to any one area or topic of the standard of practice, but actually I think there's probably a few topics in there that are useful. So review, I mean, things like threat intelligence, security testing, security event logging. There's a whole topic on that. So it depends kind of on your review processes and how you review those risks and when and things like that. But there's certainly material in there that can help you on that journey. Okay, so that was the standard of practice. I next want to look at the ISF QIRA methodology. Like I said, this is certainly the newest risk assessment methodology the ISF has. It actually covers off 5 areas, I think, that we discussed at the start. So aggregation, treatment, analysis, reporting, and obviously assessing. And it's using quantitative techniques to assess risk. But like I said, it does a bit more than that. I think there's a bit more to it than just purely assessing risk. So let's have a look at some of those. So the first one is analyze. And this is a slide from a presentation that I'll be giving at Congress this year in Manchester. And it was born out of the idea that currently QIRA it's a very good process. We've had very good feedback, but we aren't seeing a lot of people taking it up as a process to use in their organization. And that is mainly because a lot of organizations aren't necessarily looking at quantitative risk assessment to the same level that perhaps they are qualitative. And there seems to be as well, there's sort of a big, I don't know what you'd call it, industry player. They've maybe monopolized it a little bit. I don't think they ever intended to, and we've done some quite good work with them. And that's the fair approach. So I wanted to kind of understand where QIRA could fit in with fair, and actually I came away with the understanding that they can both be used very, very well in unison to achieve a common goal. So The light blue color on the screen there, which is marked analysis, that is essentially fair. Everything else in blue is QIRA. So QIRA covers off that entire diagram. I would say that FAIR does a very good job at risk analysis, but I think QIRA perhaps does a slightly better job when it comes to the entire assessment piece, because of that treatment and that reporting angle that QIRA goes on to after the analysis. But that's not to say that you can't slot in FAIR and use it together with QIRA to actually produce a hybrid approach, which could be really, really powerful. But in terms of analysis, so like I said, the light blue covers off the analyze part of the risk management component, and that's the same with IRAM2 as well. So both approaches look to determine your risks. What they do beyond that is they also go over into assessment and then treatment as well. And there we go. That just shows the kind of full assessment process versus the analyze process. Aggregation. So, like I said, the QIRA is very, very good for looking at very small sort of, what's the best way to put it? You can break it down into different attacks. So we call those threat events. So something like a malware attack, DDoS attack, anything that can potentially cause harm to your organization without really considering who's launching the particular attack. And it might not be a adversarial attack. It could be something accidental, an incident within your organization, or an environmental incident like a hurricane or a flood or something like that. So QIRA is very good at looking at those individual loss events and establishing which could be your sort of number one issue. So it could be that you are particularly susceptible to a malware attack or a ransomware attack, and QIRA would show you that. It would show you your a large proportion of your risk sits in that particular area. But it also then aggregates everything together. So it will give you your overall score, your aggregate risk, and then it will break it down into individual units to give you that sort of more detailed view. Beyond that, aggregating individual assessments is also a lot easier because you are dealing in financial figures. You are dealing with loss. You are not dealing with a risk rating such as low, moderate, high, whatever. So actually aggregating those assessments becomes a lot easier. Now, that's not something that we do in the tool. The tool is really for one individual assessment, but all of the results generated from the tool are in a hidden sheet within the tool. So it's very easy for a practitioner to take a couple of those and aggregate them together to give that overarching aggregate risk. Treatment, so or treat. This is actually done in the model phase, which we spent a long time trying to think of a name for this particular phase, and we settled on model because what you're doing is you are modeling different treatment options. So you are coming up with different options to then report back on and say, look, these are the options that we've come up with. Which one do you think we should go with? These are the return on investments for each one. These are the risk reduction figures and everything else. So what we're really doing here is we're looking at our internal controls, and we are looking at how much we want to improve those controls. We're almost running simulations a little bit to say, look, this is how we currently are, but if we implement these controls, our risk comes down by this range, and these controls cost this much. So on that basis, here's the return or potential return on investment. So the model phase within QIRA is actually really powerful for sort of simulating those different treatment options. And then report. So reporting is the final phase in QIRA. And again, this produces a lot of graphs, a lot of visuals that can then be used within a report. And I think probably the best one is the loss exceedance curve. So this basically, the red line there is our aggregated risk. The blue line is our risk appetite, and that can all be set within the tool. And the black line is our modeled risk. Now, again, potentially a strange phrase. What we're saying is The red line is our sort of risk analysis, our original risk, our aggregated risk across all of those different threat events. And the black line there is what it looks like if we implement this particular series of risk treatment options. So you're kind of showing visually that black line. So the goal obviously is to get that black line completely under the risk appetite line, or to a point where you are happy to accept it. And that's a really nice way of showing that in a visual. And I think when it comes to reporting, and I think this is why we get asked about it so often, it is difficult, like to show something very quickly and succinctly, to get your message across in 5 minutes is difficult. And I think using that sort of quantitative approach, using these particular graphs, they're quite easy to explain, and they do put your message across very quickly. I personally think QIRA is very powerful in this area in terms of giving you visuals to use within your reports. I mean, you can also write risk statements as well using the graph. So that's the other good thing. You can interpret these graphs in various different ways and view them in different ways and analyze them in different ways. It's that power of having, I think, risk represented by a financial range gives you more options in terms of reporting. And that's all brought together in a tool. So every sort of diagram we've seen up to this point, excuse me, is taken directly from the QIRA tool, which is Excel based at the minute. We are thinking about moving this over to a web application, purely because Excel has its limitations, certainly in terms of processing. We run a series of Monte Carlo simulations within the Excel sheet or within the Excel tool. And if you do all 20 of the threat events, then it starts to take minutes. I mean, it's not too bad; it's about 2 minutes, but there are limitations with Excel, and we've kind of hit those already. So the next natural step really is some sort of software, online kind of cloud-based application. Okay, that was QIRA. If anybody's interested in knowing more about QIRA, please do get in touch, because it's the next project that I'm moving on to full time, and I really want to look at how we can make it easier to use, how we can perhaps explain it in different ways, how we can look at using it with, say, FAIR or maybe another or some other kind of industry processes that are out there. So please, if you do want to know more, please get in touch. Okay, and the third piece of ISF material is IRAM2. So this is assessing risk using qualitative techniques within the IRAM2 framework, and this covers off everything that QIRA does, really. There's a few less on that particular slide than perhaps with QIRA. I just think QIRA has a few advantages, but that's not to say that IRAM2 doesn't have advantages in other areas. They're different methodologies, they're different approaches. I wouldn't ever say one is better than the other, but there's certainly kind of pluses and minuses to using either a qualitative or a quantitative approach. So it's a 6-phase methodology. It starts with scoping, and you will see some crossover here with QIRA as well. So both of these approaches have a scoping phase, for instance. Both these phases have a kind of risk treatment phase. It might be called something slightly different, but it's a similar kind of approach. But it's a 6-phase qualitative methodology. It was developed to fulfill 6 high-level objectives. So applying a simple, practical, yet rigorous approach. Focus on the business perspective. I think that's really important. Both of our methodologies come at this from a business perspective rather than a purely technology perspective. So we're looking at impact or loss to the organization rather than the risk to any one server. It's kind of generally called, and we've certainly got it in one of our methodologies, a top-down approach. So you're starting at the kind of business level and you are filtering down to the technology which supports the business. And that's done through looking at business processes and business objectives and things like that. Obtain a greater coverage of risks, focus on the most significant risks. So there's different stages where you can sort of maybe ignore some data that you've determined up to that point and focus more on the sort of what's looking to be your higher risks. Speak a common language. I think that's really important across any risk assessment methodology within an organization. It goes back to that idea of, if you are reporting risk, it needs to be reported in a way that everybody can understand. And a big kind of advantage there is if it's reported in the same way as operational risk, technology risk, whatever other sort of risk disciplines that you have, and engage with engage with key stakeholders. So again, that's a common theme throughout both of the methodologies. So from an assess perspective, we have this process. We have these 6 phases. They break down across 20 steps, I think it is. And you can see there the bigger phases with the more steps. You can see where the sort of the main body of the work is. Phase C and D deal with likelihood. So this operates on the traditional kind of likelihood impact risk equation. QIRA operates on a frequency financial loss risk equation. Yeah, I mean, I won't go through all these steps just in the interest of time, but you can see the level of detail and rigor that goes on in the actual assessment part of the methodology. And then analyze again. Yeah, I think you can kind of take a couple of those phases away potentially and look at sort of the pure risk equation in terms of the in the analysis, and that's all that work is done in phases B, C, and D, and brought together in phase E. And I think we have a slide of the risk equation. So yeah, this is what underpins IRAM2. It's taken a step further. So the traditional risk equation, as I said, likelihood taken together with impact gives you your risk. We've taken that a step further and developed something called an information risk equation. And that's really looking at likelihood in terms of a threat, which is a sort of traditional actor, nation state, criminal group, employee, something like that, initiating a threat event which exploits a vulnerability. So for the likelihood part to be complete, you need those 3 kind of elements, and they're all determined in phases C and D. And then impact is determined in phase B, and those are all then taken together, all those various different metrics, and this gives us our information risk. And that's all done within the tool. So this whole process, all these steps are done within a series of tools. So we have both an Excel tool and we also have a web application for IRAM2 as well, which leads us in to treat. So before I talk about sort of the treatment elements of IRAM2 in any to any sort of large degree, I just want to quickly go over the 2 sets of tools. So we developed about 5 years ago a series of Excel tools for IRAM2. These were very popular. We are quite good at Excel, I think, in the ISF in terms of building tools. And we started to hit the limitations of Excel again. There were certain things our members wanted to do with the tools, which just weren't possible. So a couple of years ago, we took the decision to build a web application. And this is a screenshot from that particular application. We still have the Excel assistants. They're still supported every 2 years with a control library update. But a lot of our tools are now migrating across to that online environment. So we'll have 4 by Congress. So we have IRAM2, we have Benchmark, we have oh dear, it's gone. Standard of practice, which was in this presentation, and then at Congress we're going to be launching a supply chain tool as well. So as I said, this is a screenshot from the web application. You can see the 6 phases down the left. So it just automates large parts of the methodology. So rather than you having to sort of, maybe using an Excel sheet, aside from the structured tools that we offer, or Notepad or something like that, it just gives you places to record data. It will perform sort of determinations and calculations, and it just makes it a little bit easier to apply the methodology and automate large parts of it. Treatment, though, is one area where the web application does excel, if you pardon the pun, over the assistance. And that's mainly because we built in this idea of you can build treatment plans and simulate them. So in the Excel assistance, risk treatment is a bit kind of light touch. In the web application, because we have a large table which shows how relevant our controls are to all the various threat events, we can determine, based on the threat event in question, which controls are going to be best. So we know the controls that are most effective against that particular threat event, and we can then sort of establish whether or not we have those controls implemented, or if we do have them implemented, how well implemented they are. So on that basis, we can add new controls to our treatment plan. We can add existing controls and increase the implementation level. And at the end, we can click a button and it will rerun a lot of the calculations, and it will tell you whether or not that treatment plan, if implemented correctly, would reduce your overall risk. So in that respect, the online sort of IRAM2 web app has a lot more to offer over the Excel assistance. Okay, so that's we've come to the end of the presentation. I'm going to hand back to Dan now, who's got a few slides, and then I think we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So Dan, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you for deep diving into both those risk assessment methodologies and tools as well. There's so much to unpackage, and I can see some of the questions coming in already. But just a couple of slides really about the ISF. So to summarize, anyone listening on the line that's particularly interested in accessing any of the risk assessment tools, you have to become a member of the ISF. And in doing so, you'll be joining over 450 global organizations, from government entities through to large multinationals. They all leverage some component, tool, methodology, framework, report, or event that the ISF creates or runs. And I think that's key, is the ISF, and what I typically like to talk about is the triad of value that the ISF brings. Now, Gareth has sort of deep dived into the tools element, except we have a ton more, not just the risk assessments, but benchmarking, supplier, vendor management systems, and some others as well in the Align tool suite. We've got the second piece, which is the research and reports, which is essentially driven by the ISF members and hot topics that they are considering and concerned about. And then the third is the events. So I believe I actually have another slide talking about the events that we host. Now, we typically host 3 chapter meetings per country, where we have a chapter per year. So all the way from Central Europe through to the States, North America, Australia, South Africa, to the Nordics as well. And it's a bustling community of security practitioners and risk managers and CISOs and CIOs that attend these events. But it's not just chapter meetings. I know a lot of our members are really looking forward to ISF World Congress next month. I think it's just a couple of weeks away now. But we also host a lot of workshops and security solution development workshops as well, when we're looking at developing new implementation guides and reports. And for any of you that prefer the digital content, we do have a ton of really interesting podcasts, both from an external speakers and keynotes through to analyst insights as well, covering the entire spectrum of information security and risk management. So if anyone is interested, go onto the public website to access some of this freely available content. But behind that membership paywall, there is tremendous value, not just from the tooling and the reports, but access to the wider community as well. So yeah, we've got a bit of time now left, about 15 minutes or so, to deep dive into some of the questions. So if I just expand the question pane. Okay. So we've got 3 questions coming in at the moment, Gareth, and I'll start with the middle one, because it's something that I typically cover as well with some non-members that are interested in accessing our risk assessment tools. And it's, how do you know what's right for you as an organization? Is there a hybrid approach for using Quant and Qual, or IRAM2 and QIRA? How should an organization sort of address that challenge?
Yeah, so there isn't currently a hybrid approach which uses both IRAM2 and QIRA. But actually, when you start looking at the two processes, you will see a lot of similarity. They both, for instance, heavily depend on threat events and scoping which threat events you are or you feel that you are most concerned about. So IRAM 2 takes a slightly different approach to get there. QIRA is a bit more kind of free text, I suppose, in terms of choosing the threat event, whereas IRAM 2 has a bit of a process to get there. But that's not to say that you can't use the two in unison. So you could potentially use IRAM 2 to obtain that list of threat events and then take that list and transfer it across to QIRA and then start using a quantitative approach. You could look at your business impact assessment, for instance, which in IRAM 2 is done on a qualitative basis. So traditionally 1 of 4 ratings, but we have different categories. So financial, operational, legal and reg, health and safety, and reputation. Now, most of those can be rolled up into a financial figure. The only one it feels a little bit crass to do is health and safety. But even in that regard, you could do it, I'm sure. So there's sort of ways that you can look at IRAM 2 and start applying quantitative techniques. And there's ways that you can look at QIRA and say, okay, well, actually, IRAM 2 is quite helpful here. So whilst we haven't developed a hybrid approach, it's not to say that the two can't work quite nicely together. I mean, at the end of the day, they are different approaches. So you can't do an IRAM 2 assessment and convert it to a QIRA assessment. Well, I suppose you could, but it wouldn't be particularly easy. So they are different. But it's a bit like with QIRA and FAIR. The two can be used nicely together rather than saying, well, this one's better than the other because it does X, Y, Z. So I suppose, short answer, no. But it's not to say the two can't be used together because there is a lot of crossover.
Okay. And the second question here actually builds on what you just said there about FAIR. And how does QIRA compare to FAIR in its current format? Are there any sort of similarities in the structure and methodology, or are they very, very different?
No, so there's definitely similarities. So FAIR is very much an analysis methodology. So this is something I'm going to expand on at Congress because we've done, we've spent some time with the guys that produce FAIR, and they've come to our London office and we've done some workshops with them, and they were really the first. I mean, there was quantitative methodologies out there, but theirs was the first really, I think, to take off in information security in the way that it's done. And a lot of people use it, and there's tools that back it up, and it's a solid approach, but it is an analysis kind of methodology, whereas QIRA is an assessment methodology, and I think it's quite an important distinction. But that's not to say that one is better than the other. I certainly think for some of the kind of analysis work that QIRA does, FAIR can be very useful. So again, you can start with FAIR. You can start analyzing your risks using the taxonomy that they and by the way, I think that approach is really good. That taxonomy of risk, I think, is a brilliant way to very quickly demonstrate how the process works. And you can start using that taxonomy, inputting your data. You can make it as, I wouldn't say easy, but you can make it as hard or sort of a little bit simpler based on which level you come at in that particular ontology. But you can analyze your risks in FAIR, and then come across to QIRA and start looking at treatment. And actually, there's a book on FAIR where they do talk about the idea that they are an analysis approach rather than a full. They don't necessarily offer the sort of range of treatment capabilities that QIRA does. So again, I think the idea of using one with the other can be really powerful, and that's what I'm hoping to demonstrate at Congress in a bit more detail, that the two can be used together and they're both very good at slightly different things.
Yeah, nice. Yes, it's interesting. I've spoken to members myself that use the quantitative risk assessment for really high profile projects, for example, and then for sort of assessing different technologies or systems or applications or whatever, they'll use IRAM 2. So it's not to say that they can't both be used in the same organization, but it depends on the use case.
Someone told me about a guy that used to help build airports. A bit of a strange segue, but he was very, very good at what he did. 30 years experience, and his sort of speciality, was where the runway needs to go. So he'd turn up on site. All the quant people would have done all their calculations and spent probably a couple of weeks like, oh, it needs to go there and be this long. He'd turn up, and then in 2 hours he'd go, right, that way, that long, done. and they were always close. So I
Yeah.
think, you know, there is a place for both approaches, and maybe it depends on levels of experience or, you know, amount of data that you have at hand. But there's a place for both, I think, definitely.
I suppose it's got to be highly contextualized on what, for example, senior management or boards want to receive in terms of outputs, and that kind of builds into my next question. You said that long that way, it's kind of reminiscent of some company boards that we've spoken to. But where are you seeing the future of risk assessments going? Do you think we are genuinely moving towards that quant route, or do you think there'll always be space for a sort of qualitative risk assessment methodology when it comes to cyber?
Yeah, I think there will. I don't know where it's going to go, but I can definitely see advantages to using a quantitative approach. And the big one for me is that reporting in financial figures. If you can give you know, this is our potential loss versus this is our requested investment, this is the return on investment, I think that can be quite powerful. I know the counter argument to that is, well, that's a potential loss and that's an actual expenditure. So, you know, we might be paying $500,000 for a new set of controls, but you're telling us that you know, we're just potentially going to lose 10 million if we. So it's difficult to sort of, you know, it's not like spend $500,000 and save 9 million on the other side, because that money hasn't gone anywhere. It's potentially going to go somewhere if you get attacked. So yeah, but I just feel like in terms of reporting and in terms of aggregating and the sort of Monte Carlo simulation stuff that sits behind it, it's all about trying to reduce subjectivity for me.
Yeah.
And making it a bit more objective. And I think introducing those more mathematical approaches is a good way to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got a couple of questions here. The first one here is around accreditation, and it says, can any of these materials help with ISO 27001 accreditation?
Yes. So I
Easy
won't leave
answer.
it there, but yeah. So 27001 is obviously a process that you follow. A large part of that is risk assessment, risk treatment, plans, things like that. So yes, they don't mandate that you use 27005, which is their risk assessment methodology. So you can use other risk assessment methodologies. It's more about showing that you've followed a process. And in that respect, and we've done a couple of webinars on this in terms of, you know, how you can use ISF materials. The other one, the other quite a big one as well, 27002, which is obviously ISO's control framework. We map to that from the standard good practice. So again, as far as I'm aware, 27001 don't mandate the use of 27002. So you can use other control frameworks. And because we have that link with 27002, right up to the 2022 version, then you can kind of use standard good practice material to help in that sort of treatment aspect. So yes, we're actually, I mean, internally we're sort of undergoing accreditation, aren't we? So, you know, we're looking to use ISF materials. We may produce some kind of documentation on that on as a case study, and I think that would be quite useful, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And one other question coming in. I mean, I'm happy to answer this one. It says, do you offer consultancy around these areas to organisations that are not ISF members? Now, tricky one. I mean, the best way is obviously to become an ISF member. Then you get access to all of the tools themselves and can adapt them as you see fit in the Excel format, or have full control over the data in the applications. We do offer consultancy services and support. Really popular engagement we do is sort of redesigning the business impact reference tables and training organizations to run the assessments themselves. So yeah, we can support non-members as well. It's just we never typically do, really. So we always have the pool of members in the membership to support anyway. And on the other side, members have access to individuals like Gareth and the team to speak to and discuss best practice in this space. And I believe there's a ton of training as well, right, throughout the calendar year. So people can attend in different countries or in the webinars too. Is that still correct?
Yeah, so we offer IRAM2 training. We're going to start offering QIRA training, I think, probably next year. It's obviously all online at the minute. I mean, we probably could go back face to face, but we just haven't seen the appetite for it. We've tried a few times to get a few places and do a few face to face workshops, but I think people are settling into the sort of new normal of being online and consuming online training. So yeah, but I mean, we just respond to that, and you know, we're able to offer actually more workshops in that format anyway. So yeah, and they're well attended as well. You sort of regularly see 20 to 25 people at each one. So
That's good. Good. Well, I think that pretty much is the end of the questions there. I can't see any more filtering in, so we can pretty much wrap it up there, I think. But not only does this conclude the session today, but it also concludes the ISF Cyber Security Showcase week as a whole. I do hope that you have found this week insightful, and I'd like to thank you all for your participation throughout the week with the comments, questions, and feedback you've been giving us. I'd also like to give thanks to all of the sponsors that have taken part this week, and also to our ISF analysts who have together created some fantastic content for the community to raise awareness within organizations. If you have missed anything throughout this week, it will be available on demand via the Cyber Awareness Hub, which you can access down below, where you will also be able to download your free Cyber Awareness Month resource kit. If you've enjoyed today's session, please feel free to leave a rating down below. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a great weekend. And thank you, Gareth, for your time today.
thanks all. Thanks, Dan.